So after the collapse of the Neo-Sumerian dynasty and the kings of Ur, again we have a power vacuum that kind of occurs. You have a fragmentation into a series of city-states. But then by 1792 BCE, we have a new group really come to dominance and power, and this is Babylon. So the Babylonian dynasty begins with a king named Hammurabi, and Hammurabi takes power over Sumer by, again, about 1792. And Hammurabi is well known for several different things, but probably what he's best known for, in addition to conquest and his military abilities, he's really probably best known for his law code. So Hammurabi is the first ruler in history we talk about to actually codify a set of laws in a written format. Now, this doesn't mean that laws didn't exist prior to that, because they certainly did. But what it does mean is that he was the first person to actually have these written down, codified, and set into stone, quite literally. And we'll be looking at an example of that in a moment. The Babylonian Empire eventually falls, after a couple hundred years, falls to the Hittites. And the Hittites we'll talk about a little bit as well. This was a people from an Anatolian people who came essentially from the region where Turkey would be today, and conquered Babylon and then returned, leaving it essentially in ruins. So what we're looking at here is the best known object really from the Babylonian dynasty. This is the stele with the law code of Hammurabi. Now, there were probably many more of these. Other steles, which would have been erected throughout the Babylonian sphere of influence, that also included these codified laws. But this is the one that we have really that remains and survives. It's carved into basalt, which is, again, a very heavy dark stone, not that dissimilar from diorite in some ways. And it's quite large. It's 7'4". Like some of the other examples we've seen, this one, of course, is located in the Louvre in Paris. But again, after Sumer basically fell to the Elamites, there was a couple centuries really of just independent city-states. When this changes again is when the ruler of Babylon, Hammurabi, rises to power and conquest. So he ruled, Hammurabi specifically, from 1792 to 1750, and was the founder of this first Babylonian dynasty. He saw himself as being really the chosen of the sun god Shamash. And Hammurabi himself was actually, he was Amorite. He was from a group of people from Syria that kind of assimilated into Mesopotamian life, and he really very quickly rose to power and dominance. Babylon ended up becoming the cultural center as well of this region of the world, of ancient Sumeria. And as I mentioned previously, the code of laws that he creates and codifies is the earliest known written body of laws. And it includes lots of very specific penalties and requirements. So there's specific things in there for, if you harm a noble or a merchant or a slave, and the penalties are quite different for each. The law code that we're looking at here, this object, is really quite interesting in that first off, of course, the whole lower 2/3 or so you've got covered in text. But above this, we have an image, which is really quite remarkable. And in this image, what we actually see is Hammurabi himself in a conversation with the sun god Shamash. Now, there's a couple of conventions that are used here, and some that we're already quite familiar with, and some that are really challenging traditional conventions, really, here. First off, you'll notice the hierarchical scale is certainly clearly used. You can see that even from this overview image here in the scale of Shamash relative to that of Hammurabi. Hammurabi and Shamash are both presented in, to some extent, the typical combined views where you've got a mix of frontal and side view. But let's take a look here at a closer image and see if we can get a little bit more of an idea of what's unusual or remarkable about this. So here in this close-up view, we can see a couple of interesting things going on. Let's talk about Shamash first, the sun god. First off, envision how tall this guy would be if he was to stand up. He's massive, right? And that's because he's a god. He's intended to look huge. He's intended to be very, very large. But there are some things here that are also a little unusual. For example, you'll notice that for the first time, the horns that are depicted here are in fact depicted in a profile view. So rather than combining the perspectives and showing the horns frontally, projecting out to the sides, they're shown as you would actually really see them in that frontal view. Now his shoulders and some other features here are still done in a very frontal manner. Also his, the beard and other elements here are really quite stylized. Another interesting aspect, by the way, you may notice there are actually flames rising from his shoulders, again, tended to show his power and divinity. So he is seated here. He's having this conversation with Hammurabi, and he's also handing him something. You'll notice there's a rod in his hand. This is a symbol of divine office or of kingship, and so this is really a way for him to validate his authority. Hammurabi here is showing, well, see, I'm chosen by Shamash. Here he is in this image, offering me this rod, which is symbolic of rule. Now, Hammurabi himself, as you can see, is quite a bit smaller, which is only appropriate, although with Shamash seated, the two are virtually the same height, which is, again, a nod to Hammurabi's power. So Hammurabi, again, is shown in mostly the traditional frontal profile view, but there's something a little unusual here. You notice that his shoulder seems to turn in and overlap. This is really probably the earliest known example of an attempt really at what we call foreshortening. And this is a much more complicated, much more sophisticated means of visual representation. And so the use of that here is really a very significant convention. So again, some of the things that we see going on in this image, we see hierarchical scale, we see some use of foreshortening, we also see the use of a mix, to some extent, of profile and also of frontal views. So the next image we're looking at here is a series of monumental lions, and these in fact are not Babylonian. These actually come from Turkey, and these are items, these massive stone lions that guarded the entrance to a citadel, which was the capital for the Hittites. Now, as I mentioned previously, Babylonian rule doesn't go on forever, and the Hittites, in fact, invade, and they defeat the Babylonians in 1595. After they defeat them, they return back to their homeland in Turkey, and Babylon really falls into the hands of another group of people called the Kassites. And really, again, we have a period kind of really, again, a power vacuum, if you will, where we see independent city-states and things fracture once again throughout the Near East. But the Hittites, again, from Turkey, were the first people really to utilize structures like this in the exterior of a citadel, these massive stone lions. And this format, this concept, becomes really quite popular. We're going to see other examples of this later on, looking at other peoples. And you'll see examples, particularly with the Assyrians, that get really very sophisticated and complex. These lions, again, are about 7 feet in height, and they are positioned in a way to kind of guard the entrance to this structure. Which is made of massive, rough-cut stone, and obviously projects a very strong and stable visage to anyone who would have been, entering into the site. So we've briefly mentioned the Elamites, and they're kind of throwing them in here with the Hittites and with the Babylonians because we're talking about roughly the same period in history. And when we talk about, though, when we take a look at the Elamites, there's a couple kind of important things that we'll look at. And this artwork here, this image, is really kind of an interesting one. This is from the ruins of Susa. And this is a bronze and copper portrait of Queen Napir-Asu. She was the wife of a very powerful Elamite king, whose name was Untash-Napirisha. So this statue, which dates to about 1350 to 1300 BCE, somewhere in that range, is really quite unusual in a couple of ways. One is its weight. It weighs 3,760 pounds. Now, keep in mind that it's only 4'2" in height, so it's not a tall statue. So the combination of those two figures right off the bat should tell you that there's something a little unusual here, because bronze or copper are traditionally hollow cast. This one isn't. It's solid. It's actually made with a solid bronze a plug, if you will, a core, and then a hollow copper shell. So why? Why would you do this? Why would you make this so incredibly heavy and massive? Well, you may remember we talked about some other earlier artworks, for example, the Victory Stele of Naram Sin, and we talked about the fact that those were not in their original location, their original provenance, because they had been looted and taken back to Susa. So the Elamites had a tendency to kind of go and gather things. When they would invade another area, they would take the best stuff and bring it back with them. And so naturally, Queen Napier-Asu didn't want that to happen to her statue. So what she did here is she decided she wanted to have an image of herself that was very, very, very permanent. And her solution was to make it so incredibly heavy that no one could ever steal it. And in fact, there's even an inscription on the skirt of the statue which says, "He who would seize my statue, who would smash it, who would destroy its inscription, who would erase my name, may he be smitten by the curse of the gods, that his name shall become extinct, that his offspring be barren. This is Napier-Asu's offering."